So this is our Simondon reading group. We are picking up from page 156 of Imagination and Invention. That's 156 in the translation. So we are in the fourth part on invention. We've looked at, in this part, we've looked at a few different types of invention or sort of stages of invention. So we looked at detour behavior in animals, the capacity of an animal to, when it's trying to reach a goal, to sort of provisionally move away from the goal in order to reach that goal through this detour. And then we looked at tool use in animals. And of course, there's this sort of tradition that goes back to probably the Stoics of taking tool use as sort of characteristic of the human being, this Homo faber tradition. But this, of course, turns out to be false. There are many animals that use tools in different ways. And so, of course, using a tool, or especially creating a tool, requires, again, a sort of detour, not a detour necessarily in physical space, but a detour in sort of conceptual space. So instead of, if you have some sort of problem or some sort of goal you're trying to reach, instead of sort of directly going to try to approach that goal, you instead take this detour of building a tool or, selecting a tool out of the environment, preparing it in some way. And then after you've prepared the tool, then you sort of use it to reach the goal. So it requires a certain amount of understanding of the situation. You have to understand what are the properties of the objects in your environment and how you could modify those properties to make one piece of the environment into a tool that would be useful, that would help you achieve your goal. So you have to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the different properties of your environment and how you can modify those properties, and then what the future state would be if you were to modify those objects in that way. And then we looked at this bit, invention concerning signs and symbols. So this is where we still are, the second section of this part. And so here, Simondon was talking about the relationship between technical invention and science. And so one of the key ideas here is the idea of abstraction. So when you build a tool, you're sort of or a machine or whatever it is, you're sort of operating on a concrete object. You're taking some sort of object and modifying its properties in some way. But then if you want to, for example, explain to someone else or teach someone else how to make that tool, you have to abstract from the concrete specifics of this particular tool. You have to explain like what the technique is, or what the operations are that you have to perform on any object of this kind to produce a tool of this kind. And so this need for communicability is part of what is part of the sort of prerequisites for abstract conceptual knowledge of a situation. So there are many animals that are capable of selecting a stick or a stone or whatever that has the right properties to perform a certain action, but I don't think there's any evidence that any other animals besides humans communicate the properties of objects and how to manipulate them. There's definitely social learning in other animals, but it's mostly through imitation, is what it looks like. So one monkey will observe another monkey manipulating a rock in a certain way to break a nut, for example, and then we'll try to imitate it, and eventually we'll learn how to perform that action in a sort of efficient and reliable manner. But there's no, the monkey doesn't sort of explain to the other monkey, this is how you break open a nut. Whereas with humans, of course, we have sort of craft knowledge that you learn as an apprentice. You sort of you work as a blacksmith or whatever, or a carpenter. You just sort of watch the master. You sort of try to imitate it, and so this is a similar type of learning as in the case of the monkey or a bird or whatever. And this knowledge you might not be able to communicate. You just have a sort of feel for when the metal is too hot, or when the wood is being sawed in the right manner or whatever. But then there's also learning that is more sort of formal in the sense that you can write it down in a book. You can have like an encyclopedia that explains like how to build a certain machine or how to design, how to like what properties a tool has to have to be useful in this respect. So you can write it down, you can teach it in the classroom, you can explain it verbally. So this is a sort of conceptual knowledge that is transmissible in a way that the craft knowledge is not. And this is sort of like the first step towards something like a science, because science, of course, is a kind of knowledge that has to be communicable. It has like this is sort of one of the key principles of the opposition between science and craft knowledge is this communicability, and so this formalization or abstraction from the concrete circumstances is like a prerequisite for something like a science to develop. And so Simondon talks about this idea of an encyclopedic thought, and this is something that we've seen in other texts from him. And so this is a sort of ideal of fully explicit knowledge, or making human knowledge fully explicit. So taking everything that is in the realm of craft knowledge and sort of implicit feel of like how to do things, and turning it into an explicit knowledge of that can be communicated and ideally written down in a book. So this sort of ideal, this sort of movement also leads to things like the systematization of weights and measures. So we talked about this last time in the sort of French Revolutionary context, how all these sort of local weights and measures were replaced by a uniform national system of weights and measures. And some of the goals for this replacement are to make commerce more effective or more efficient. So instead of having to sort of look at the price of wheat in like, one bushel in this town might be slightly more than one bushel in the next town. And so comparing the price of a bushel of wheat is like you have to convert the bushels and the price. So it just makes it more complicated. And then facilitating eventually things like standardized parts. And this is something that often was imposed by military contracts. So if you're an army, for example, and you order 1,000 muskets from some workshop, you have to ensure that all these muskets meet certain standards of the barrel is so long and has this width and whatever. And so there's like the measurements have to be standardized so that the actual product can be standardized. And so this again is meant to facilitate the development of technical objects in the sense that you now have these standardized parts that you can use, and you can sort of assemble these parts into new technical objects. So again, there's this encyclopedic thought and this standardization of weights and measures are sort of means to allow for invention to occur in the recombination of those parts. And you have these sort of preset schemas that you can apply. You have an understanding of what a spring does, what a lever and a pulley, etc. All these simple machines, you know what they do, and then you can sort of put them together to produce a desired effect. So all of these elements all go towards making invention more likely to happen, or make it easier to perform. So yeah, I think that's about what we saw last time, or up to last time. So I'll ask someone to read from subsection 2, subjective formalizations.
I can read. Subsection 2, subjective formalizations, normative and artistic. But another mode of formalization is possible, separated from the first through a dichotomy that is necessary to preserve the homogeneity of operative modes. Everything that is not operative, that is, everything in the relation with the world that is affective, emotional, may also be formalized and expressed according to subjective categories, that authorize participation in action through the communication of a feeling or an emotion, or a definite mode of resonance, retentissement, or of motivation. In this sense, action, individual as well as collective, is distinct from an operation. It too has its modes of compatibility, which are norms and ritualizations, but not processes. The arts and religious modalities of collective life correspond to the formalization of action by opposition to operations, according to a dichotomy that is translated by the separation of leisure and work activity, even if celebrations punctuate the great phases in the patterns of work over the courses of the seasons. More specifically, it is artistic formalization that is opposite to the operative modes of work. The time of art is that of leisure, while religious formalization is the principle and guarantee of this dichotomy and of the alternating rhythm between leisure time and work time, highlighting the transitions, changes of regimen, ritualizing the key moments of the beginning and end of labor and leisure, propitiating the start of work through the offer of first fruits, thus facilitating the separation but also the compatibility of modes of work and leisure. The calendar is religious, with the complex structures of good omen and bad omen according to time and place, with then an implicit logic of beginnings and endings, stoppages and resumptions. The religious modality of formalization in our societies corresponds to the rhythm of holidays and commemorations, inauguration ceremonies, graduations, and rites of initiation or exclusion. Everything that performs an action as an absolute origin or end of an existence. Everything that institutes, voids, or converts in an essential way. At all such occasions, invention provides modes of expression and communication that are necessary for collective participation, and it operates a discovery of compatibility within the whole set of ideals of the group. A declaration of war or a treaty signature are actions existing as formalized and communicable performances tending towards a universal expression. Revolutions, too, as well as a large part of political theory, unfold by inventing at each turn a new system of compatibility, creating norms and a new systematic framework for the relations among individuals and among groups. Law, together with the legal universe as a whole, is a development that is contemporary with the formalization of action. Each new extension of the domain of human action is marked by an invention authorizing a systematic framework of compatibility, embracing this domain, international law, then space law. In each era, normative inventions discover a compatibility for modes of existence that had neither meaning nor points of insertion in previous normative structures. Such inventions provide a symbolism of action by producing an expressible universe of norms while responding to problems. Hence, Christianity offered norms for relationships between those who had rights and those who didn't in ancient city-states. It provided a city of norms, resolving the problem of compatibility between empires, nations, and individuals, and overcoming within the city the limits of religious prohibitions. The Sabbath is made for men, not men for the Sabbath, and customary juridical obstacles. He who has not sinned, let him cast the first stone, or the norms of relations between rich and poor, nationals and foreigners. Axiological formalizations concern the key points and key moments of action, principally in the form of a system of axioms for decision-making that lead to a universal representation of the world and humanity, and which are expressed in a symbolism of action that can be taught and propagated. This symbolism sets up a system for the conversion of actions into one another, enabling them to be compared and relate to each other, even if they unfold in conditions that are heterogeneous and concretely dissimilar according to place, time, and the empirical surroundings of each subject. Invention in the normative domain also tends towards the universal. So I'm actually not totally sure what this distinction between the operative and everything that is not operative, I guess what the boundary would be between operative and effective emotional. But I think he wants to associate it with work and leisure, with religion sort of marking the beginning or end of like work periods or leisure periods. And I wish he had said a bit more about art. I like this idea of religion as the formalization of absolute ending and beginning. But I think I would need to hear more about how art is a formalization of leisure activity, because it's an interesting suggestion, but he doesn't really say very much about it.
Yeah, this bit is a little bit compressed. I think this distinction between the operative on the one hand and the affective emotional on the other hand has to do with whether you're sort of directly transforming something or so in the case of operative activity, you would be the sort of prototype of this would be like taking a piece of clay and imposing a form on it. So you're actually transforming something outside of yourself, and you're producing a product which is separate from yourself. Whereas affective emotional activity, you're not producing something distinct from yourself. You're transforming yourself, or you're undergoing a transformation. And I think that's roughly what he's sort of distinguishing here. And so here we're talking about a formalization of affective emotional activity, and so religious sort of ceremonies would be sort of a key example of this, in the sense that you have you have ceremonies like baptism, marriage, funerals. These are sort of common to many different religious traditions. The sort of mark moments of transition or transformation of some kind, where you pass from one state to another, or you sort of move from existing in the world to not existing, and so yeah, these sort of formalizations like religious ceremonies or legal obligations. So there's like the sort of ceremony of signing a contract. It's you have to sort of formalize the actual agreement is something that happens before the contract is signed, but then the sort of ceremony of actually signing the contract is what makes it sort of pass from like an agreement to a legally binding contract. And so you are undergoing a transformation or bringing about a transformation in yourself by signing a contract. And so these are examples of this kind of formalization. And when he talks about religion here, we can also think like, of course, there's religion in sort of the strict sense of the term, in a church or a temple or whatever. But in our society, or in Western societies where religion has a less, or religion in the sort of strict sense has a less prominent role, there are still things like holidays, where there are certain times of year where you sort of separate, or like these moments in the year are sort of set aside for marking a transition, whether it's like a change of seasons or the new year that happens. You have a celebration to mark a transition to a start of a new year. And then we have, of course, ceremonies like graduation ceremonies, where you're passing from a student existence to a post-school existence, usually a workforce existence. So yeah, any type of like ceremonial marking of a moment of transition or transformation, I think, would count as religious in this sense for Simondon, like a broader sense of religion, where like even a school graduation ceremony would be a kind of religious action. So this is a sort of formalization of this affective emotional transition, and it's important also that these formalizations are collective ones. So like every person undergoing a transition from a student state to an employment state will have a different set of emotions, a different sort of emotional response to this situation. But this sort of shared ritual or this shared ceremony allows you to sort of put those emotional responses into a kind of framework, and make sense of them, and sort of like not sort of go through it on your own, but instead you go through it with a group of peers, and you have I don't know, parents and professors and whoever are present at this ceremony, and so you're sort of undergoing the transition in a sort of comprehensible way, as opposed to this very obscure individual transition. So this collective nature allows you to sort of make sense of these transitions in a way that would be much more difficult if you had to go through each transition individually.
A little bit later, he talks about amplification and formalization, but reading back through this, it's helpful. I guess I see it as kind of another one of the like missing examples from Individuation Volume 1, where he just didn't give very many examples in psychic and collective individuation. But the way that I'm reading this is that these formalizations, sort of like the more highly formalized, the more sort of structured the something like the command becomes, or the explanation. And so the more highly structured it is, the more different domains it can amplify through. And it's, the more, so it like plays the role of the seed crystal in structuring these different, like even social and religious domains.
Yeah, I think we can connect this with his notion of this like intensity of information or attention of information that he wants to introduce in to sort of complement the notion of the quantity of information transmitted in a message. So a sort of a religious ceremony, for example, might not like the actual sort of information conveyed in the message is minimal in the sense that everyone or most of the people attending this ceremony already knows what the leader of the ceremony is going to say. Like if you go to a graduation ceremony, the speech that the speaker gives generally doesn't have a lot of surprises. It's sort of like standard, inspiring messages that everyone's heard before. But or again, like a religious ceremony in a strict sense is even more formalized. You have like particular phrases or chants or whatever that you have to repeat, and even like postures of the way you're supposed to hold your body can be explicitly set out as like part of the ceremony. So there's not a lot of surprise, or there's not a lot of like new information conveyed in the ceremony, but at the same time there could be a very high tension of information in Simondon's sense of the word. So it can be this religious ceremony or graduation ceremony or whatever it is can serve to structure a whole period of someone's life. If it is something like a graduation or a wedding or a baptism or whatever, these kind of ceremonies can sort of set the tone for years to come. Your life may be sort of transformed by this ceremony marks a sort of transformation of your whole life, and so this ceremony can have a structuring power or structuring influence over a whole period of your life. This sort of high tension of information, like this formalization, this very this sort of stock set of phrases and gestures and so on, can have a very high tension of information, even if the quantity of information transmitted is very low. Okay, I can read the next bit. As for artistic invention, to the extent that it performs a formalization of leisure, it also produces a complete and universalizable representation, participating in the specific logic of each genre and each form of art. Successive inventions of symbolic forms recruit by enlarging the effects and modes of appearances of reality, which initially were not recognized as citizens within the artistic domain. Formalization proceeds in the direction of extension and the discovery of compatibility among originally heterogeneous data. If we consider only the still recent instance of cinema, we can see that this art, initially considered as a formalization of the vision of motion, successively integrated sound, then color, by discovering the modes of compatibility of their simultaneous use. With every new incorporation, purists reacted on behalf of the homogeneity of each art by proclaiming the destruction of true cinema. But this art has developed. It is currently discovering the logic of its compatibility with a new world of broadcasting and production that is television, and with the techniques authorizing this narrow compatibility, the recording of images on magnetic tape. The key to such successive extensions is the fact that a new element is not, subsequent to its incorporation, what it would have been in an isolated state, as a unique means of expression. Hence, sound was first speech in cinema, that is, the contribution of the actor's parts, and in this, of course, it doubled the image without mixing with it. A film became a tribune for speeches, tirades, or argumentation. Then, with the broadening of the notion and techniques of the soundtrack, sound integrated noises, and speaking came to the level of noises and sounds, becoming at times non-comprehensible or insignificant. In this new form, speech became compatible with the entire sonic content and with the image, whether it was emphasized or accessory. Color, too, will be entirely compatible with the other compositional aspects when, within one work, and in alternation with these other aspects, it can be either conspicuous or barely perceptible, rather than being merely the opportunity to pick colorful subject matters. What is truly the invention of an epoch in the domain of artistic symbolism is a mode of compatibility between previously isolated forms. In the 17th century, it was architecture that played this role of permanent and universal panegyric of the arts because it placed the integration of sculpture, painting, fine woodwork, and the art of gardening and fountain craft within organized synthetic wholes such as palaces or mansions. Renaissance Italy had paved the way in this area. Prior to the Renaissance, religious architecture had constituted the milieu and universal symbolic system integrating sculpture, painting, music, and singing. At the end of the 18th century, and especially during the 19th century, it was literature that offered an open domain to particular modalities, attempting to make things visible and audible, absorbing within its specific means the plastic arts, painting, drawing, illustrations, and engraving, making the book into the milieu of the compatibility of the arts, thanks to the development of the printed text. Cinema and then television took up the baton from the book and the newspaper as vehicle of the arts. It would be a mistake to treat them as separate arts comparable to music, sculpture, or theater. They form rather symbolic systems of compatibility resting on a technical invention in progress, as printing was at one time, annexing itself to large-run lithography and engraving. Every step in technical invention serving as platforms enables a broadening of the compatibility between particular arts, to the extent that cinema and television are like architecture in the 17th century or the book in the 19th century. A house of arts rather than an art seeking to stay within itself under the pressure of a professional group, inhibiting the opening of a permanent invention. Formalizations are always accompanied by domination. In the normative domain, it was at times religious thought, at others political theory, and at yet others a legal research offering to quote-unquote values a compatible grouping by constructing a complete system in accordance with the dominant issue of the moment, which became like a vast house for all other problems. After the legal system of the French Revolution, a socio-economic system followed which incorporated in turn all the other aspects of normativity by situating them with respect to its categories. This process is comparable to what we see at play in the arts, where in each era there is a dominant art form functioning as a reference system for and containing the others. For this reason, the symbolic frameworks of action and of art are affected by historical relativity. Their synthetic capability is that of an organizing dominance rather than an absolute universality. Every system inserts itself in a chain of inventions. This bit is a bit difficult, I think. So maybe the first bit is relatively straightforward. So it's this idea that within art we have these sort of master arts or arts as a house of arts. So architecture in the 17th century was a way of coordinating all these different artistic activities, painting, gardening, sculpture, etc. All these things were sort of incorporated into one, or the ideal was to incorporate all these things into one sort of harmonious whole that would be the palace or the mansion. And then we have in the 19th century literature as this sort of universal art that incorporates all these different elements of art or these different domains of art that have to be coordinated and turned into this harmonious whole in the book. And then cinema and television for the 20th century are these sort of forms of coordination of various arts. And so Simondon points out that in the development of cinema, you have, of course, it starts with black and white and silent movies. And then it first incorporates sound and then later color as elements. And he suggests that the sort of first step of this incorporation is to sort of make the newly incorporated element, the focus of the artwork, right? So like in early films with sound, you have dialogue becomes sort of the centerpiece of the film, and so it's the film is centered around like speeches and dialogue and the spoken word in general. And then he suggests that as the incorporation of sound into the film sort of progresses, that speech becomes one element among others in the sound in the soundtrack of a film. So of course we have in contemporary films there's the actual dialogue, but there's also sound effects of various kinds, like Foley effects and things like that. And then there's music, and all of these elements are supposed to work together. And it is not always the case that they sort of fit together properly. And I know a lot of people have complained about movies over the last, 5, 10, 15 years having worse sound, especially for dialogue than previously. That it's harder to understand what people are saying in movies than it was before. So maybe there's a sort of maybe this incorporation of dialogue into the soundtrack has gone too far in some respects. So you can see this sort of movement of this new element is incorporated and becomes the centerpiece of the art form, and then it sort of slowly gets incorporated as just one element among others. So dialogue appears alongside music and sound effects as parts of the overall soundtrack of a film today.
This point in the last paragraph about formalization and domination, I think, is interesting. So maybe in the next section, he talks about amplification and control. And I know that in Individuation Volume 1, the sort of the problem that is resolved by signification is always relatively open. The problem sort of sets the conditions of its resolution without like providing the lines of the resolution. I think he puts it that way. And I wonder for Simondon, with something like, I guess, an artistic medium where there's a given formalization is predominant. I wonder if at the psychic and collective level, if the form of the problem is like relatively open compared to, it would seem like it would have to be compared to like the kinds of seed crystal that can propagate through a given supersaturated solution. And also, whether he would say that they're capable of like de-differentiation, or like counteractualization, I guess, to use a Deleuzian term, from a given formalization so that they can be like a legal system can be reworked or, an artistic medium can be radically reconceived.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So this notion of domination here in this last paragraph, I'm not 100% sure whether he. I think what he might be saying here is just that he's talking about domination sort of in terms of conceptual domination, so that one art form, one sort of formal structure dominates others in the sense that it subsumes them, it incorporates them within itself. So the way that cinema incorporates sound and visuals into one art form. So I think that might be what he means by domination here. But there's also the other side where we can think of domination in terms of like a social hierarchy, where there might be a kind of correspondence between a formalization and social hierarchization. So this sort of appears most evidently in the case of architecture in the 18th century, where he talks about the palace as the sort of ideal incorporation of all these art forms. Of course, not everyone lives in a palace. only particular people have the capacity to enjoy this art form that unifies all the other art forms. So yeah, I'm not sure whether he wants us to think of both of these notions of domination at the same time, or whether we're meant to focus on the sort of conceptual hierarchy. I'm not sure what to make of that exactly. But I think also we can, like when he talks about the French Revolution, and he says a little bit earlier about how revolutions serve as a kind of, what did he say? Yeah, revolutions too, as well as a large part of political theory, unfold by inventing at each turn a new system of compatibility, creating new norms, etc. So yeah, a revolution, of course, has a destructive element in the sense that it destroys some existing social arrangement, but it has this constructive element as well. It institutes a new norm, a new way of relating people to each other, of relating people to the rest of the world, etc. So it's a revolution is like maybe the most extreme case of this kind of formalization. It's it's a kind of marking a transition that only happens once, as opposed to like a graduation ceremony or a New Year celebration or whatever. This is something that happens every year. It's sort of repeated, and it's marking a transition that happens over and over again. Whereas a revolution is a transition that only happens once. It's not repeated. But this, in each case, whether it's a transition that only happens once or a transition that happens every year, there's still this sort of compatibilization of something that wasn't previously compatible, or this discovery slash invention of a realm of compatibility of something that wasn't compatible before. So yeah, it's there's definitely a lot of connections we can make with individuation in this last paragraph. But yeah, it's quite dense. So what exactly? Like, I don't think we can unpack everything in this paragraph.
I wonder what he has in mind exactly with the example of literature in the 19th century. I was thinking maybe something like I know that Odilon Radon did like engravings for Baudelaire's Fleur du Mal, something like that kind of incorporation of different artistic media due to technological advancement, like printing here.
Yeah, it could be. I'm not 100% sure either. I mean, engraving is pretty much as old as the printing press. Actually, I think possibly older. I think there were some, uses of engraving to reproduce images before there was movable type, if I remember correctly. In the 19th century, of course, you have the development of printing technology that makes it much cheaper to reproduce books, newspaper, etc. So this allows for a mass distribution of reading material that was not quite as accessible even in the 18th century. So that could be part of what he's talking about. But I think maybe he's also, so it might be that the book incorporates the visual, not so much in that it actually incorporates engravings or plates or whatever. That's one element, but also in the way that the novel in the 19th century has this sort of universal role. The novel is sort of this encapsulation of society as a whole. Like any sort of social problems are sort of expressed in the novel, and the sort of palette that a novelist has available to them includes descriptions of visual effects, the scenery and what a person looks like and so on, but also sound. All the different sense modalities are things that can be incorporated into a novel. So I think maybe that's part of what he has in mind here. This sort of totalizing or universalizing role of the novel in the 19th century. And then also I'm thinking of Mallarmé's idea of the book, with a capital letter, this sort of universal book that would have this sort of ceremonial of reading. Like he had this sort of elaborate plan for like how this book was going to be read in like different passages would be read every day or every week or whatever. I can't remember the details. But like this sort of ceremonial associated with the book. So we can think of something like this possibly as well. This kind of literacy culture or literary culture, I guess, and the 19th century is also the period when the literary critic becomes sort of a key figure in intellectual life as well. So appreciating the novel or literary works in general, understanding their significance, explaining that significance to other people is like one of the key roles of an intellectual in the 19th century, and is sort of meant to lead people into a greater understanding of the art form as well. So maybe all of these things together are how the novel or the book sort of incorporates other domains of art into itself. Okay, let's go on to the next subsection. I'm not sure which of you are willing and able to read today, but if I can get a volunteer to read the next page or so.
I can read again. Subsection 3, processes of amplification in formalization. The source of compatibility in inventions of formalization is also a process of amplification, of recruitment, through which a small and simple structure governs and modulates realities that are broader, more complex, and more powerful. In metrological formalization, compatibility is realized by the discovery, beyond complex realities such as volumes or densities, of a simple structure forming the basis of a system, fundamental units, and of their mode of combination, for instance, the decimal system with its prefix deca, hecto, or kilo. The most complex relations between quantities to be measured find here a possibility of reduction and commutation. They become commensurable. The same goes in the axiological domain. To invent a moral framework, for instance, means finding a system of fundamental units sufficiently simple and sufficiently close to the subject so that it can be anterior to any complex case submitted to a normative decision. The morals of each class or caste in ancient city-states had no common point and were not mutually compatible. The invention of a morality of compatibility with Stoicism consisted in setting up as a source of normativity a fundamental and primordial image simpler than that of any already codified activity, and thus capable of modulating such activities. That of the role of the persona, which may be equally that of the soldier or the emperor, and which possesses an intrinsic normativity as role play, playing to the end or playing well. When the ancients discovered that slaves were humans rather than speaking goods or tools, they bestowed a normative structure on the master-slave relation by modulating it through the model of the simpler and more primordial relation of father to children, justice, protection, etc. It is the smaller and simpler reality that serves as a paradigm for the broader reality and governs it. In Christian morality, the rule of reciprocity, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and in a more concrete way, the model of fraternity as a basis for all human relations, give to a very simple and spare situation, less charged with social formalization in the relation of father to children, the power to model the infinite diversity of relations with others. Fraternity is the standard situation, pure and simple, which is amplified in governing relations with others in accordance with the morality of charity. In this way, a recently invented moral framework installs itself in the interval of indifferences that remained below the threshold of previous morals by means of a finer normativity. It does not contradict those morals, but avoids having recourse to them, resolving the problem before the former normativity would come into play. Hence, in the episode of the adulterous woman about to be stoned, Christ makes the morality of charity bear on the interval of indifference, separating the stoning in itself and the casting of the first stone, with the sentence, quote, "He who is faultless, let him cast the first stone," unquote. He introduces an examination of one's conscience that creates a situation of reciprocity between judging oneself and judging others. In order to throw a stone at the adulterous woman, one would have to throw it at oneself too. Thus, the first stone was never thrown because the new norm set itself below the law, in the interval between the judgment of oneself and the decision to act against others, between the inner self and the gesture. Kant proposes a still more universal normativity that no longer retains even the concrete being in all its affectivity, but only a goodwill and a respect for the reason in oneself as well as in others, which amounts to considering the human person as an end rather than a means. Increasingly simple structures then serve as the basis for normative formalizations, each representing another invention. Yeah, this is very interesting. I know in individuation, he was sometimes critical of like knowledge by induction, basically, because the idea, as we've discussed a few times, is that the more extension concept has, the less concrete that concept is. But the same kind of generalization seems to be what allows for the amplification of these normative rules or normative frameworks, so that basically the example of the stoning, this norm about reciprocity is like more fine-grained than the norm that it intervenes on, and so it is able to kind of slip in this what does he call it, interval of indifference, and govern the situation because it is more general and has more extension, and therefore is less bound to any particular concrete situation.
Yeah, I think here we see maybe the connection between, like, why does he use the same term formalization for the operative side, the technical knowledge that is formalized into this encyclopedic knowledge on the one hand, and then for this affective emotional side, where you formalize affective emotional life in ceremony or ritual. Here we can see maybe like why he might want to use the same term for both, because in formalization of normativity, in sort of taking a normative structure and making it into an explicit code of laws or norms or principles or whatever, you are allowing those principles to be applied to more situations in the same way that taking craft knowledge and turning it into something you can write down in a textbook allows it to be transferred to other situations and other applied to new objects in a way that wasn't possible with just purely craft knowledge. So this idea of it's probably an idealization, but there's this idea of like we were talking before we started recording about Hegel's conception of substantial ethical life. This idea of a society in which everyone has an assigned role and knows exactly what they have to do in accordance with that role, and just does what they're supposed to do as like a person with this particular status. So this sort of idealized, fully determinate society in which everyone has an assigned normative status is one in which these norms, or the norms that govern one person with this status, are completely separate from the norms that govern another person with a different status, and so there's no like way of connecting those with each other. And what happens in the ancient world or in the ancient Mediterranean world, you end up with these ideologies like Stoicism and then later Christianity that sort of transcend those specific rules or those specific statuses of people. And so Stoicism, in principle, is something that a slave or an emperor can just as well use to govern their moral life or their ethical life. And even more so, Christianity is meant to sort of overcome those specific statuses of being a Jew or a Greek or a Roman citizen or not, a slave or a free person, etc. So you're allowed to sort of make reference or to appeal to these moral principles that don't belong to a specific social category. It's once so in a society where everyone has an assigned specific role, these sort of roles are not going to be formalized. They're not going to be written down or expressed in such a form that you can explicitly state them. Whereas in a society where you start to have these explicitly stated moral principles or normative principles, then you can sort of appeal to them in a variety of situations, and sometimes they might have sort of unintended consequences, or they might, a set of norms that was developed in one society might lead to, for example, slaves deciding that being a slave is actually not that great and not something that is morally justified, and so we're going to revolt against a system that holds us as slaves. So this is something that formalizing normative principles allows for them to be applied in ways that maybe they were not originally meant to be applied, and allows for a variety of different uses of those principles, and possibly against the system in which they were originally formulated. So I think this is why he sort of why he applies the same term of formalization to both the operative side and the affective emotional side, because in each case, this formalization process allows for this amplification, this sort of spread of what was applied in one situation to a variety of other situations that were not sort of envisioned when this formalization was first performed. And then it's an interesting question, I think. Like you pointed out, Simondon's criticism of inductive thinking, or this sort of hierarchy of genus and species schema of thought, where the genus is always thinner or poorer than the species that falls under it. So as you ascend the hierarchy of genera, you get a concept that has a wider extension but less and less content, until you reach like the concept of object or being or something like that, which is the most general concept. Here we have I think, or at least I think what he is intending for us to get out of this, by using his term amplification, he's pointing back toward this transductive mode of thinking as opposed to inductive mode of thinking. And so the idea is that we have a transfer from one situation to another that is not a generalization in the sense of a loss of content. So in formalizing a normative system, we in principle we don't lose that content. We're abstracting from the specifics of one situation, but at the same time we're allowing for its application to another situation. So a system of normative principles, whether it's Stoicism or Christianity or whatever, is I think the way we're meant to understand it here is something that is just as rich, as conceptually rich, as full of determination as a concrete ethical decision. So like when we pass from the society where everyone has their roles pre-assigned to a society where there are these formal principles that you can appeal to, we're not losing concreteness or specificity of the norms of our society. We instead are adopting these norms or finding these norms that allow for application to a variety of situations, whereas previously there might only have been one situation or one family of situations that are the norms that we knew applied to. So yeah, it's a sort of transductive thinking as opposed to inductive. So we're not supposed to lose content as we pass from one situation to another.
He's used the word universality a couple of times in the past couple of pages, and I wonder if for Simondon the more transductive a given like seed crystal or formalization is, sort of the more universality that. I mean, I guess I'm trying to think like how it relates to the way somebody like Hegel or Kant would use the term universal. Like maybe for Simondon, a universal is just a concept with a very high degree of transductivity or like potential or actual amplification.
Yeah, that's a good question. So he mentions here, so on this last page that we just read, so we talked about Kant as a more universal, Kantian normativity as more universal than Christianity. And then I forget where exactly we saw this previously, but in the last couple of pages, he did use that term a couple more times, if I am not mistaken. He points to this idea that there's a sort of universalizability in principle of formalization, and so I think the universalizability in the one sense, just means this capacity to be applied to any situation of a given domain. Kantian normativity is more universal than Christianity in the sense that it doesn't. In principle, Kantian normativity doesn't have to do with affectivity at all. It's all about practical reason, and so any rational being, angels or Martians or the inhabitants of Saturn that Kant believes in, they would all sort of be subject to these norms, no matter what their affective life might look like. They might be organized in a very different way. They might desire very different things than human beings, and have very different responses to situations than human beings do. But insofar as they are rational beings, rational practical beings, they would have to obey these same norms of practical reason. It's more universal in the sense that it applies to more entities than Christianity does. But I think maybe we can think of this not so much just in a quantitative terms of like how many entities fall under this concept, but in terms of this, as you said, this sort of tension of information concept, or this potential for transduction. So certain notions, certain formalized ethical theories or ethical systems have this capacity sort of intrinsic to them or contained within them to structure other situations. And so a normative system would sort of be more powerful or would have a higher tension of information the more of this capacity to structure other situations it has. And so that would be more universal in that sense. So it would be a sort of intrinsic universality or internal universality, as opposed to just like counting how many entities fall under these different concepts. The Kantian normativity would be more universal in the sense that it has a greater capacity to structure situations, including our relations with the inhabitants of Saturn, if we ever were to encounter them. They would fall under the norms of this concept in the same way as our relationships with other human beings. I think that's maybe more what he has in mind when he talks about universality. Yeah, he in his Natural History of the Heavens, I believe is the title of the work. He argues that I think we might have talked about this before, but he argues that the moral integrity of rational beings depends on the density of the matter of which their bodies are composed, and so the gaseous planets like Saturn have very thin matter or very low density, and so the beings, the inhabitants of Saturn, would be more moral than we are with our sort of thick, high density matter. So yeah, it's pretty cool.
That's great. Beings made of like tungsten would be super immoral, I guess.
Yes, I think the inner planets. I think for Kant, there's like a sort of direct correlation between the density and the distance from the sun. So the inner planets would have the most immoral beings. So I guess we shouldn't go visit Venus or Mercury.
Gives a new meaning to calling somebody dense.
Yes, that's true. Okay, so let's go on to the next page. I can read this, and I'll read to the end of the section here, and I think that's probably where we'll end for today. The various formalizations bring about compatibility in the form of an interaction between the various orders of magnitude of a staggered reality: family, city-state, inhabited lands. The invention of new formalization amounts to discovering a smaller and simpler model closer to the subject and serving as paradigm for larger orders of magnitude. Formalization thus gives an exemplary axiological value to an action ever more purely inchoate, which amounts to augmenting sensibility and at the same time the universality of the formalization, thanks to the inner structure of amplification. In this form, invention, whether practical or symbolic formalization, is the result of an interaction between a present field of finality and an accumulated field of experience. The act of invention is not essentially distinct from the organized modes of growth characterizing organisms. In the course of growth, a structure recruits and distributes resources provided by the milieu for an amplifying result. The weak and minimal endogenous reality governs and distributes exogenous reality. For the organizing interaction to be performed, organized materials must be homogeneous and sensitive to the fields distributing them by modulating their flux. And while the data of perception retain a relative heterogeneity and adhere to objects, images resulting from experience and expressing it are endowed with a relative homogeneity and fluidity, making them mobile. All things being equal, the genesis of images up to the oversaturated state which follows the encounter with the object produces, for mental syntheses, an available content comparable to that which processes of integration provide the organism during growth. Molecules in a metastable state in their external relations are almost neutral, rendering them easy to distribute with forces of a weak level. Yet internally they hold a high potential energy, which becomes available when they are distributed within the constituted organism. Organization is possible because it is performed during the latency state of reality subject to organization. The genesis of images, the progressive saturation across phases, provides a reserve of contents in a state of latency, almost neutral externally, yet internally and intrinsically rich in possibilities of transformation. Such is the imago with its polyvalent character. Inside the complex imago, the condensed experience constitutes a system of potentiality comparable to the large molecules of organic chemistry. The imago may be mobilized by a weak field. The imago that may be mobilized by a weak field brings with it a considerable reserve of accumulated experience. Such too are the results of exploration and free manipulation, or, quote, experiments just to see, unquote. Around each center provided by the perceptual and motor reference to the object, a polyvocal system of properties of things and the organism's modes of access is constructed that is externally closer to the neutral state than was the spontaneous motor initiative or the perceptual encounter. Organization occurs when simplicity rules a flux of complex realities, and this is possible because complex realities can provisionally be in a state of latency, enabling them to manifest as weakly polarized externally and to free their content once they have been put into place. So this is quite abstract. So yeah, this is again very closely tied with individuation, the book Individuation. So here he's describing invention as a kind of individuation, as a kind of genesis, and he's comparing it to growth of an organism. So when an organism grows, and again, the sort of simpler case is the case of the crystal growing in the solution, because in this case you just have a repeating crystalline structure, a cubicle or whatever the shape of the crystal is. So the crystal just sort of reproduces this form over and over again in bigger and bigger parts of the solution. An organism, of course, is much more complicated than just a crystal. It has not just this one sort of repeating structure, but it has a sort of articulated structure in the sense that it has different organs, different types of tissue, and so on, that all have to be produced in the right proportions. And as an organism grows, those proportions change as well. So the growth of an organism is much more complicated than the growth of a crystal, but in principle, it's the same idea of taking in matter from the environment and structuring it in accordance with the structure of the existing already structured entity, in this case, the organism. And then the process of invention is similar in the sense that you take this sort of domain of images that are acquired through, as you pointed out earlier in this section, through play, or the way he puts it here, experiments just to see. So you pick up a stick and sort of poke things with it, or you bend it or whatever. You sort of learn what its properties are. You're not sort of aiming at a specific goal. You're just sort of playing with the stick and figuring out what you can do with it. And then later, when you have some situation where you are trying to reach a certain goal, you sort of the images that you've acquired of this stick come to be incorporated into the structure of the situation. And this is what an invention is. So you're trying to get at the tasty ants inside a tree, if you're a chimpanzee, and you suddenly sort of remember, or these images come to mind of what you've learned about sticks just by playing with them, and you decide, I'm going to pick up a stick, strip off the leaves, and then stick it into the hole in the tree and get at the ants. So this relatively simple invention is a sort of growth of the capacity of operation of the chimpanzee by restructuring the images that make up the mental life of the chimpanzee, in the same way that the growth of an organism is a restructuring of the set of chemicals and materials in a particular environment, absorbing some of those materials and restructuring them so that they form tissues and organs and so on. So yeah, that's sort of what's going on here, is this analogy between growth of an organism and growth of the operative capacity of an agent of some kind, by restructuring the images that make up its mental life. Yeah, this bit is very dense. Maybe we can come back to it a little bit next time as we read the rest of the part, and we go into the next section. We can sort of see if we can make more sense of it. But it's putting the content that he's been developing in this book in connection with, or with this lecture course. He's putting that content into connection with his more strictly philosophical work in individuation, and he's sort of applying this schema of the genesis of an individual to the genesis of an invention. So invention as a process is a kind of genesis of an individual within our mental life.
Yeah, I guess, what I can understand about these two paragraphs, it does seem very similar to that other dense paragraph a couple of sessions ago, where he talked about the high valency sort of future state image recruiting a lot of these lower valency, more like lower intensity learning images, and we talked about in relation to like the invention of the airplane, but also, as you already mentioned, these building these lower intensity images through like exploring an enclosure or learning a territory so that you can take detours and stuff like that.
Yeah, so in that passage, he was talking about how there's a sort of balancing of this high intensity image, which is the goal you're trying to achieve, getting at the food or getting at the whatever the goal is, being able to fly in the case of the airplane. This high intensity image has to be balanced by a much greater number of low intensity images, like all the properties of the objects that you've encountered, the properties of the territory that you've explored. In the case of the airplane, all the scientific knowledge that goes into the development, scientific and technical knowledge that goes into an airplane. You have to know what a internal combustion engine is. You have to know the properties of steel or metals of various kinds. All these different things have to be sort of present for you to be able to counterbalance the desired goal state with its high sort of polarization. He's definitely pointing back to that passage here. But he's now connecting that idea back up with this schema from individuation of the genesis of an individual. So this high polarization is now being connected up with this notion from individuation of the high tension of information, or of this capacity to structure a field. So the image that has this high polarization also sort of brings about the transformation of the whole system of images, or it's the connection between the high polarization image and the lower polarization images, brings about the transformation of the whole structure of the field of images, so that now the solution of the problem sort of stands out, or just sort of comes to mind immediately. There's also a bit in On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects where he talks about how certain technical objects have this property of sort of producing their own conditions of existence, in the sense that one part of the object or one element of the object can only function because some other element of the technical object is also functioning. So like he talks about a certain type of turbine, for example, where if I remember correctly, the cooling function of the turbine is sort of incorporated into the actual rotors of the turbine. So like without this cooling function, the turbine itself would not be operable, but the cooling function is something that is brought about by the operation of the turbine. And he suggests that in this case, or in these types of technical objects, it's because we are living beings that we can sort of give life to these schemas of operation. We can sort of apply our capacity, like this sort of self-producing property of a living being, to a technical object in our thought or in our imagination. We can sort of use our schema of life as self-production to make sense of this kind of self-producing or self-conditioning technical object. I think that passage is also relevant to what he's talking about here. So when we invent something, in the sort of proper sense of the term, or the more strict sense of the term, we're sort of applying the fact that we are living beings to some sort of object or some sort of domain of existence. We're using that schema of self-conditioning to sort of structure a new situation, a new domain of existence. Okay, so if there are no other comments or questions, then I think we should probably end here, since we're almost at the 2-hour mark anyway, and we're at a good break in the text. So the next section C, is quite long. I think it's like 15, actually it's more than 20 pages. We'll spend a few weeks on that. But that takes us to the end of part 4, and then there's just the conclusion after that. So we're getting towards the end of the book. We have about 30 pages left in the book. So we're getting there.
That's great. We got through this much faster than individuation.
Yeah, that's
much longer.
Right. And also much less dense in most parts, aside from a couple of passages.
Right.
Okay, so thanks everyone for coming out. Hope to see you next week, and we'll pick up from page 163, section C.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nan. Talk to you all next week.